Today I'd like to talk a little bit about our MemoRail MemoSense transmitter and then specifically look at the programming DIP switches on the front faceplate of the transmitter that you can use to ensure that the transmitter is programmed correctly to communicate to the right sensor that you're talking to and then output correctly to whatever control system that you're using. So let's just talk a little bit about the MemoRail itself specifically. So obviously the MemoRail is a MemoSense transmitter, so it's designed to work in conjunction with our MemoSense cables and sensors. It is a DIN rail mounted transmitter, so it'll mount in a cabinet, in a panel, something like that. Obviously it can be done that way because you can take advantage of the offline calibration functionality from the MemoSense sensors, so you don't need necessarily to have a screen on your field-mounted transmitter that you're going to use for calibration. So you can go ahead and take advantage of the compact design and mount it in a cabinet, connect it to your MemoSense sensors that are out in the field in your process, and then use a tool like our Portavo handheld meter to do the calibrations of the sensors when needed. So we've got a couple different versions of the MemoRail. I'll look at the dip switch options for both. This one's a single input transmitter with a 4-to-20 output and the option to add a second 4-to-20 output. So that would be the first option that we would have. And then you also have the ability to utilize a MemoRail transmitter with up to 2 inputs in and then a Modbus output to communicate to a Modbus control system where you can pull registries and look at various pieces of information from that standpoint. So those are the two options that you have. From a MemoRail standpoint, you've got your single input with your 2 4-to-20s out, or you've got your up to 2 inputs with your Modbus out from the MemoRail Modbus version. So looking at the outside of the transmitter, obviously you have a wiring diagram and a diagram to show you how to program the dip switches on the side here. So this is going to be key in figuring out how we want to go ahead and program them. You also have your terminals on either side for your power, your sensor inputs, and then obviously your outputs from your sensors as well. So looking at the guideline for how I want to program, we can go ahead and move forward here and diving into exactly how we set the transmitter up with our dip switches. So this is an illustration of the MemoRail 4-to-20 version mounted on a DIN rail. So obviously this is what you would be looking at if you were looking at the transmitter mounted in a cabinet or a panel. We would be looking at the front faceplate right here. And here's where our 8 dip switches reside. So this is what we would use to either switch one way or the other to program the transmitter correctly. So obviously if you take the dip switch and you move it here to the left, that it's indicated by this black circle that stands for on, or how it's designated as on. If it's switched over to the right, it's just the open white circle, and that would be designated as default when we look at the side panel of the transmitter. So you really only have 2 options. You either have it switched to the left or you have it switched to the right. So it's pretty straightforward. Easiest way to switch the dip switches would be to pull up this front glass protection and then just use a small screwdriver to come in here and then slide the dip switch over to one way or the other. Looking at the side panel of the MemoRail, this is obviously where all the information resides on how you have to set up the dip switches correctly to be able to indicate which sensor it's connected to, and then how do we want the 4-to-20 to be spanned and outputted, how we want to set up the temperature, and then also how do we want it to indicate that there's a potential failure with the transmitter. So just going over the dip switches real quickly, up here at the top we have dip switches number 1 and 2. So you can see this is how you would set them to indicate which measurement parameter we're talking to. So obviously we have PHORP, we have oxygen, we have conductivity, and then we have inductive conductivity with our 670. So as I mentioned, the MemoRail is a MemoSense transmitter. So it is multi-parameter with any of the measurement parameters that we can utilize a MemoSense sensor with. So if you wanted to set it up for pH or ORP, obviously, you can see for dip switch number 1 and dip switch number 2, both of them would be in the default side, so they would both be to the right. And then just in contrast, if we wanted to set up for conductivity, we would leave dip switch number 2 in the default, but we would then switch dip switch number 1 over to the black circle, or what's indicated by on. So that's just a quick example of how you set up the transmitter to know which type of measurement parameter it's communicating to. Dip switches 3, 4, and 5 are how you set up the 4 to 20 output for these pre-designated measurement ranges. We have 3 columns. On the left is pH, or the millivolts, for ORP. The middle is the oxygen ranges. And on the right, we have conductivity, or the inductive conductivity, with the 670. So you can see dip switches 3, 4, and 5 have varying options for how they can be designated. Depending on how you set those up, it would indicate which range you would be outputting. So one thing that's worth noting, just to make sure it's clear, if you set the transmitter up to be communicating to a pH sensor, you would have obviously a number of ranges you could set the dip switches. Those ranges coincide the same for oxygen and the same for conductivity based on the dip switches, depending on how you switch dip switch number 1 and number 2. So if that example can be made clear, my point is, if you wanted to have it set up for 0 to 14 pH, 0 to 120% air for oxygen, or 0 to 2000 millisiemens, then dip switches 3, 4, and 5 are the same. The ranges change based on the way you have 1 and 2 set up for which measurement parameter it's communicating to. So hopefully that's clear. It's pretty straightforward. You just look at dip switches 3, 4, and 5, set them to the correct side, and then you've got your range set up. Now this is a MemoRail 4 to 20 version with the second output available, so we have the option to set dip switch number 6 for our temperature output. It is worth noting that when you have the second output activated or option selected when you buy the MemoRail, that second output has to be temperature, so it cannot be anything else. So it's set up for temperature, and you have 2 options. You can either set it up for 0 to 100 degrees Celsius, and that means that the dip switch would need to be to the right, to the default, or negative 50 to 200 degrees Celsius, and the dip switch would be set to the left, or to the on. Dip switch number 7 indicates in what milliamp output do you want to indicate a failure, whether that's a failure with the sensor or the transmitter. It means that something has happened with your loop that is a catastrophic failure, but the transmitter is still powered on and it's still outputting, so it'll output a specific milliamp value to indicate to the operator that it is in failure mode. Default, or to the right, is less than 3.6 milliamps. If you have it set to the left or to on, that's 22 milliamps. And then the last dip switch is dip switch number 8. That's where we would set up for either normal operation or user specific. Now, where this would come into play is, for example, if any of the ranges that we have pre-set up for dip switch 3, 4, and 5 are not acceptable for what the particular customer would like, you can user define a range at the time of order. Now, this needs to be specified when we order the transmitter. It cannot be changed or adjusted after the fact. But let's say we pre-specified a user programmable range, and you wanted to use that, you would turn the dip switch to on dip switch number 8 to activate that user specific range. If we were utilizing one of the pre-programmed ones that we talked about for dip switch 3, 4, and 5, then we would leave it to normal, and that would indicate that it was in the normal mode. So that's an indication of how you set the dip switches for the MemoRail 4 to 20 version. Real quick before we sign off, I just want to make sure we show the slight contrast for the MemoRail Modbus. Obviously, we still have our 8 dip switches, but they're slightly different from a programming standpoint. DIP switches 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are how you set the device addresses. 6 and 7 indicate the Modbus communication that we need to be able to communicate with our Modbus master. And the DIP switch number 8 is to indicate whether or not we have a second sensor connected to this, or if we're just utilizing a single input. So it's slightly different from a communication standpoint. Obviously, you're going to be talking Modbus. You don't have 4 to 20 outputs, and you're going to be pulling information with your Modbus registries and reading it out on your Modbus master. So this is just a quick video to explain how you set up these 8 DIP switches for the MemoRail. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward, and we look forward to hearing how easy it is to program our MemoRails out in the field. Thank you.